This is Julia Cowley. Thank you so much for being with me. She is a retired FBI profiler who has a podcast called The Consult, which I highly recommend. Julia, what do you think about Gary Artman now confessing at the very last minute after being so defiant that he did not kill anyone?
Well, I think what struck me when you were just reminding us of how he came to confess to some of these crimes is when he reached out to the detectives and to investigators, he described them as the bodies. Or I want to talk about bodies, which I find is very impersonal. It's just something I noted. So I don't want to read too much into that, but I find that very impersonal. And deathbed confessions, it seems kind of cliche, but they do happen. They happen for all sorts of different types of offenders, whether it's a serial murder, whether it's somebody who's just killed one person in their past. But we do hear of this, and it's not unusual. But what I tend to think with somebody like Gary Artman is that likely at some point he realized that to reach out to the detectives and make this confession of sorts somehow was a benefit to him at that point in his life. Up to that point, it wasn't going to benefit him. And somebody like Artman, that's why he does it. It's a benefit to him, very likely self-centered. And it could be from he had a premonition of how he was going to be spending the rest of his life in eternity, in hell potentially. Can I say that on TV?
Yes.
I mean, he may have, if he had, religion or anything. And we have to remember many of these, despite their outward appearance, many of these offenders are deep down insecure. And perhaps if he had any kind of inclination toward religion, he may have started to realize, I better get this off my chest because I know how I may be spending the rest of my life if I don't. And those of us that understand, Christianity, we know we have to confess so we can be forgiven. And perhaps that's a reason. Perhaps he just wanted someone to talk to during his last days, and it was just for company. Perhaps he wanted some food. Some killers, when they're in the midst of confessing, will ask for like a candy bar. Like, for example, Israel Keys, he wanted coffee and a candy bar and some food. And so the incentive may not have been some grand incentive. It could be just very simple.
Is it likely, do you believe that he would, kill 10 women in Grand Rapids ending in October 96 and then not again until 2006 in Maryland with Dusty and then not ever again? I mean, does that happen?
Yes, it could potentially happen. I'm not saying I believe him, but it could be something like he's very comfortable in Grand Rapids, and that was the area that he felt safe, and it was his lowest risk and to offend. And then when he leaves the area, he doesn't, he feels it is a higher risk, and he's not willing to take that risk to kill anybody else outside of his comfort zone. It's possible, and we do know that serial killers, they can and do stop. It's a myth to say they can't control themselves or they can't stop. Their killings are a choice, and they make that choice based on a lot of different factors. He could have stopped because of different life circumstances. He could get too busy. Serial killers, as they get older, they age out. They're not as fit. It's harder for them to accomplish things. He could have been concerned about getting caught, and it may have stopped. And then, someplace after he stopped for a while, then there became an opportunity that for him just seemed like a perfect opportunity and too good to pass up. And so then he reoffended, maybe against his better judgment. Dennis Rader, who is known as BTK, he stopped for a significant amount of time. We know also that Joe D'Angelo, who was known as the Golden State Killer, he did stop as well. And we don't know the exact reasons. I mean, they're both of them at that point in time, their lives got very busy. They were raising children. They were living just what we would, consider very normal lives. They were getting older. It is very physically demanding to do what they were doing. It's very time consuming, physically demanding. So it just may have been, I'm just going to stop for a while. And, the victim selection process is based on availability, vulnerability, and desirability. And that desirability for an offender is in large part based on fantasy. So they have an ideal, perfect victim. Usually that's the first thing to go out the window. They're never going to find that ideal victim. And then they will go to, okay, based on my ideal victim, who's available to me? And then amongst the victims that are available, who's vulnerable? And then it's the vulnerable one that will end up being the chosen victim. And
When you
so
talk about, hang on, when you talk about
mhm,
ideal victims, initially ideal, we're
mhm.
talking about often physical characteristics, right? That's
It could be physical characteristics. There could be some practical considerations as well. But yeah, oftentimes physical characteristics, or they've developed a fantasy and they want a specific type, maybe specific type of personality, or yeah, oftentimes it could be based on like physical, because visual, how somebody appears to them. So yeah, but I mean, oftentimes, if you have a victim of a certain race, statistically or probability, they're probably killed by someone within their race. But that is not a hard and fast rule whatsoever. It's also not just a matter of like whatever their victim, their whatever they are desiring may not just be solely, oh, I just want a victim of a certain race, and it could, that may not matter, that may not be a criteria. It could just be that they're, I mean, we see it all the time that victims, that offenders will cross racial lines. And many of the time is, depending on the area, it just may be a more diverse population, and that those are the available and vulnerable victims too. And it may be just more diverse, or you may have a population that's not diverse, and those available and vulnerable victims are the ones that are all going to have very similar characteristics. But you cannot rule out that you have a single offender because you have victims of different races or skin color. You just can't rule them out at all. And the desirability to one offender is very personal, and it may have nothing to do with their looks. It could just be, this person's available and these are my fantasies, and there's no more consideration than that. And then it could be extremely specific to them, but it's extremely personal to each offender, and every offender is different. Well, I'm certain whatever details he's provided to them, they're trying to corroborate those details, because as much as we would all like to believe that he was being honest and he told the entire truth, we just can't rely on his word. Now, it's probably a matter of, going back over all the details that he provided and going through their files and finding out if what he said is accurate based on the information that they have in those other investigations. I'm certain that they've probably already done this, but an extensive timeline as well. Like, where was he during each of these these killings, or when somebody went missing, where was he? And then not only that, just an extensive timeline for his entire life. Like, where was he in those areas? If he was not in the Grand Rapids area and he was outside the area, are there any other missing women or unsolved homicides that he could potentially be responsible for?